Welcome. I'm Mary Tamer, the Project Manager for Usable Knowledge here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Today I'm joined by 3 faculty members for a relatively brief conversation around Common Core state standards and their related assessments. I'm joined by Paul Revel, Heather Hill, and Dan Koritz. And we're going to talk about the adoption of the standards, which came about in 2010. And since that time, 45 states have signed on, though EdWeek has now dedicated space on their website to tracking the hundreds of bills that have cropped up to pause, review, or repeal the standards, their related assessments, or both. As of June, a handful of the 45 states who agreed to adopt the Common Core standards have now opted out, with other states considering doing the same. Part of this stems from concerns around the standards, but there's also a significant tie to the related assessments. Paul, is this the beginning of a bright new era of school reform in the United States, or the last gasp of a failing strategy for educational improvement? What do you think?
Well, thank you, Mary. I think it's an opportunity for a lot of constituents in the field who are affected by the policy to push back on the policy and to have some input and maybe to modify some aspects of this policy going forward. I think it's important to keep in mind, and I was a State Board of Education member who voted for the Common Core here in Massachusetts, and in general I'm in favor of the Common Core and the logic behind it. It's important to keep that logic in mind. We decided that it made sense, as we had in each of our individual states around the country long ago, to have a common set of standards nationwide that were voluntary, that states subscribed to, rather than have each state set its own standards, and you'd had some states with very low standards and some with very high. There was a certain sense and logic to have common standards against which you could measure progress, because the students who grow up in all the states will travel around the country and take jobs in different jurisdictions and locations over time. So it made some sense to have that kind of an architecture that was built up. We're now in an era, I think, where the assessments are coming due, and there are a lot of concerns about what those assessments will show in terms of performance in states. And because of an accelerated rush toward implementation and the utilization of things like test results for purposes like teacher evaluation, a number of oppositional forces have been set off in motion against what is conflated as Common Core, the assessments, and a whole bunch of other factors. And you have a variety of strange bedfellows, frankly, from ideological groups to political groups to parent groups to teacher groups coming together to raise serious questions about this set of policies. I don't think it's time to throw out the policies altogether, but I think it's time to have another look.
And Dan, it seems like a lot of the negativity that we're hearing about are tied directly to the assessments. What are some of the things that you're seeing and hearing in that arena?
Well, I think the timing was, in a sense, bad for the Common Core assessments. There had been growing resistance to the large amount of very high stakes testing in schools. Parents have become increasingly vocal in their concerns about what this is doing to their kids' education. And as that was building, the Common Core assessments were gradually brought, well, not gradually, fairly quickly brought on. The first 2 states to use Common Core assessments set performance standards that were considerably higher than the standards they had before, the result of which is a lot more kids are not making it. You put all that together and it's really asking for problems. I think to go back to your first question, this is another gasp, whether it's last gasp, I don't know, but it's another gasp of a strategy that's dominated American education policy since the late 1970s, which is that we should try to reform education by setting performance standards and using tests to hold people accountable for reaching them. It hasn't been a very successful policy, but what we've done now, perhaps 4 or 5 times, depending on how you count, is looked back over, say, 6 or 7 years of experience, said, well, this didn't work very well. Let's try exactly the same thing again, but with a different test, or perhaps with a different way of holding people accountable for it. And this is another iteration of that same cycle that we've gone through now time and time again.
Quick follow-up to that, though. So you said this is something that we have seen in education policy in the United States since the 1970s. So is it safe to say then that assessments are not going away? So it's really a matter of finding the right assessment or using the right assessment in the right way?
Well, yes, but those are 2 very different things. Finding the right assessment and using it in the right way are 2 very different things. There's been much more attention in this iteration on finding the right assessment than there has been on using it the right way. So there's been a lot of emphasis, for example, in finding ways to embed more complex reasoning into the tasks that are used in the assessment, improvements of that sort. that doesn't get at, that may be very desirable, but it doesn't get at the problems that are coming up because of the fact that people feel that raising test scores is the end that's desired. It's the goal in itself.
Mm. Heather, let's talk about what this means for teachers and students in the classroom. What's some of your work and what are you hearing around what's happening? And I think we hear a lot about what teachers are no longer able to do in the classroom because so much time is spent getting kids prepared for these assessments.
Well, I think similar to what Dan said, actually, there's a long history in classrooms of dealing and looking at reforms of this kind. So teachers have not, it's not like today that they started to deal with test-based accountability. They've been at this for a good 10 years at least since NCLB went into effect, and a little longer in many other places where they had sort of precursors to No Child Left Behind. And you know, I think that to complement what Dan said, though, there's this really interesting tension in education reforms, some of which are about accountability and trying to get people to sort of measure up or incent people to act in certain ways. And then another focus in some of our historic improvement systems has been actually helping people learn to do their job better, specifically teachers, principals, people in schools. And so I think that we have a little bit of both going on right now, and the question for me is, how are these two going to affect each other? And what is the likelihood that we can help teachers and curriculum writers and people in districts actually implement Common Core and give kids the opportunities to achieve the kinds of things that state policymakers and national policymakers have suggested?
So to that point about what we want state policymakers to consider, Paul, what would you ask state level policymakers to consider before making any changes to the Common Core or the new assessments?
Well, I think it's easy to get distracted by a lot of the ideological swirl that's around the Common Core standards and the assessments right now. So I'd encourage state policymakers to keep their eyes on the prize. The fundamental logic of standards-based reform, that we get clearer than we have been about what it is children should know and be able to do at various stages of their lives. And we set high standards, and we set standards in correspondence with what it will take to prepare our young people to be ready to be successful in college and career. All of that makes sense. What we do with the results that we get, how we hold people accountable for their contribution to the end results of standards-based reform, I think is something that we need to examine. So this is really a conversation about the goals. If we're talking about Common Core for the moment, not about the assessments, but if we're talking about the Common Core, we're talking about a set of goals. Now, you don't improve education simply by having goals. You might say goals are necessary, but they're nowhere near sufficient. What I worry is we've been engaged in this massive discussion about Common Core at a time, and Common Core goals are generally speaking higher than the previous state goals. We were having trouble reaching the previous state goals. Now we're going to have even more trouble reaching these higher Common Core goals. So rather than spending all our time and energy talking about the ideology of where these came from and how they're being implemented and so forth, I'd love it if we spent more time talking about strategy. How do we close deep, persistent achievement gaps? What are we doing differently in classrooms and in supporting teachers and in supporting children to enable them to attain the level of learning that these ambitious goals set for them? But if we're only talking about the standards and about our politics around the standards, we're never going to get to the strategy discussion, which should be front and center right now.
And I would like to add to that, actually, which is, what I like is this is a long-term strategy. And what I would say to any policymaker, state, local, whatever, is this is not going to happen in a year. It's unlikely to happen in 5 years. If you really want to have Common Core teaching and learning happening in schools, this is a 10-year endeavor. This is a 20-year endeavor. And one of the nice things about having gone down this path before, at least in my field, which is mathematics education, this is the third or fourth iteration of high standards, increasingly ratcheting up standards. And we can see that districts that have been coherent and made a long-term commitment to developing their teachers' capacity to teach in new ways and to offer students opportunities to really think and learn have teachers who do that. And so that's the kind of thing where you could say to policymakers, start designing strategies that aren't about figuring out how to improve your test scores this year, but about how to improve the quality of classrooms in the long term over the lifespan of teachers in the classroom right now.
Dan, what would you say to state policymakers about the assessments themselves and in terms of the rollout, when to actually use them for value-added measures or for other high-stakes uses?
Well, several things. First, let me go back to the question of responding to the standards. One of the things I found really frustrating about the debate about the Common Core standards is that they're treated as a whole. And I've had meetings with state policymakers where I've said there's a real problem with this particular set of standards in this grade. They don't want to hear it. Either you're on board or you're not on board. And there are some serious problems. For instance, in the high school level math standards, there's some things that really are inappropriate at the high school level, in my opinion. There are things that many college graduates, in fact, doctoral students, don't know that are in the high school math standards. But you can't have that discussion currently. You're either on board or you're not on board. That's a really counterproductive thing to do. There's a lot that's very valuable in Common Core standards, but it makes sense to step back and say, well, maybe it didn't come down from Mount Sinai. Maybe there's some things in it that really need tweaking. The problem with the argument about the tests is that we're losing sight, I think, of what tests can and can't do. First of all, what we've done actually longer since No Child Left Behind, for decades before that, is led with the tests. We say, all right, the way we're going to change schools is we're going to tell you that you have to accomplish these things, and somehow you're going to figure out how to do it. Gradually, the policy world is beginning to realize that that doesn't work, that we have to actually help teachers figure out how to do these things. We really need to reverse the order and emphasize first and foremost providing teachers with the skills they need and the supports they need to teach in ways they haven't taught before. But the last point I would make is that people have lost track of the fact that tests are just tests. You know, the people who designed this technology, the standardized testing technology, decades and decades ago, in fact more than half a century ago, were adamant that they should be used as a supplement to other sources of information about student performance. Because there's a great deal that we value, or at least that I value, walking into a school that can't be measured with tests, standardized tests. We've completely lost sight of that in the education policy world. And as a result, we are creating incentives for teachers to prepare students for the specific things on one particular test, whether it's a Common Core test or some other test, rather than giving them incentives to focus on the rich instruction that will have, as one effect of many, improvements in performance on those tests. That's a fundamental change that I think is desperately needed. If you look at other countries that have successful teacher evaluation systems, they don't start with test scores. They do a lot of other things besides testing students, because what they get out of student test scores is simply insufficient for evaluating teachers.
That relates to a point that I want to make. Number one, you don't fatten a cow by weighing it.
Exactly.
You know, you just,
exactly.
so that's something we have to keep in mind. And number two, I think in this era of standards-based reform, which dates from the early 90s, we've now had 20 years, 2 decades plus of experience. And I think we're also ready to think about how we go beyond the current narrow success measures that we've defined in making determinations both about students, are they ready to be successful in college and career, and our schools, are they doing a good job? And so I think what we've learned, at least what we've learned here in Massachusetts, and after all, we're the highest performing state as far as some of these measures go, is that what we have taught and what we have measured is necessary but not sufficient to either closing achievement gaps or preparing young people for success. So part of the conversation we need to welcome now, and I'd encourage policymakers to have, is what are those other elements that contribute to student being successful that we ought to take a look at? And then how are we going to make room and build capacity within our education systems to address those issues?
That's exactly right.
Yeah, and to go a step further from what Paul, not to put words in your mouth, but to be a little bit more explicit, is to say that teachers and schools only account for a small amount of the variation in student test score outcomes or career readiness, college readiness outcomes. And there's a variety of other things that contribute to kids' performance. And getting those ducks in a row actually is really important, first to the teachers who rely on those ducks being in a row for them to be effective in their job, but also to the ultimate performance of our kids nationally.
Great. I suspect we could talk about this for another 2 hours, but we're going to end here. I want to thank you all for joining me, and I would encourage our watchers to please visit Usable Knowledge for more education-based content. Thanks so much.